Let's take a look at those political systems that reject the ideas of liberal democracies. We often refer to these systems as authoritarian because the authority has so much power. So, how can they justify the rejection of liberal ideas? Well, let's look at the downsides of liberalism. Individualism creates a selfish society and ignores our need for belonging to something. Ideas like freedom of speech and pluralism make it tough to create a unified society. Liberalism fails to address the need for order and tradition. Think back to the ideas of Burke, who saw the chaos created by the liberal French Revolution. Authoritarians also point out that liberal societies define freedom differently than they do. For example, in a communist society, freedom comes from the government creating security, as the competition created by capitalism creates fear. The crisis theory is the idea that when there's something difficult going on, like an economic collapse or global pandemic, people will turn to powerful leaders who promise to fix their problems, even if those promises are not actually achievable. Those leaders will justify to the people that they must give up their individual rights to solve the crisis. They'll say the goals of the state are above selfish individual objectives, so the collective welfare of the state must prevail over the privileges of the individual. In this society, only certain people are sufficiently intelligent and energetic to rule. Let's face it, there's some real idiots that get the chance to rule in a democracy. Why not find the best and the brightest in our country and ask them to rule? This is known as the great man theory. Finally, unless people's beliefs and actions are strictly controlled, social organization will break down. Why would you give individuals rights? Think about school. We tell you where to sit, when to go to class, what you're going to learn, even when you can go to the bathroom. Why? Because if we didn't, we believe the school would be a madhouse. Like the list of the 8 techniques of representative democracy, I've created a list of 5 key techniques to have a successful dictatorship. The first technique is force, whether real or threatened. But there is a drawback. It's very expensive in terms of time, personnel, and other resources. It can also create a new opposition if you push too hard, so you have to be careful using this powerful tool. Next is indoctrination and propaganda. It's especially effective in the education system to convince people your ideas are the right way to go. Third is direction of popular discontent, which means to build up hatred against real or imagined enemies to divert attention away from the government. It's also known as scapegoating. Fourth on the list is controlled participation, where the people are given the appearance of having a voice in government to keep them peaceful. And finally, you have to have a vision to give your people a view of what your government can accomplish. Then they'll support almost anything you do. There are different ways we can classify dictatorships. The one we're most familiar with is autocracy, which is ruled by one person, like King Henry VIII. A junta is a military dictatorship. This often occurs when the military leader no longer wants to support the dictator they helped get into power. More rare is an oligarchy, which is a rule by a group, like the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1990s, or the religious leaders in Iran. And finally, if a democracy is not respecting their minority groups, we call it majority tyranny, which, for example, could be seen in the US prior to the Civil Rights Movement, or South Africa with apartheid, although this is actually minority tyranny, but that's for a different lesson. Also, there's a difference between a dictatorship and a totalitarian regime. There's a saying, all totalitarian regimes are dictatorships, but not all dictatorships are totalitarian. You can have what's called a benevolent dictatorship, where the leader of the country is not elected, but still rules with consideration for the needs and wants of the people. Whereas a totalitarian dictatorship is the type of dictator we usually think of, the megalomaniac who wants to control all aspects of society in order to maintain their control. So what are the basic characteristics that identify if a nation has a totalitarian dictator? There's usually an official plan that covers all vital aspects of human existence. That includes things like who you can marry, what job you can have, and even whether your life is protected. Totalitarian dictators are confident they're the best man to do the job, so why bother with opposition voices? The government will ensure the police and military are backing them by controlling access to weapons. Remember, a dictator is one person or a small group. It's the weapons and soldiers that make them more powerful than the citizens. The government controls all means of mass communication, so the media and internet, because they have to convince the people they're the best, that their lives are better because of them, and don't let them see them doing anything wrong. And there must be tight control of the economy, because how are they going to pay for all that military force and propaganda unless they have the cash? We're pretty familiar with the cons of dictatorships. Just look at the Holocaust, the Ukrainian famine, the killing fields of Cambodia, the torture chambers of Saddam Hussein. So are there any pros to a dictatorship? Of course. Things get done so much faster in a dictatorship, so you don't have those pesky legislative debates to deal with. Think about the economic growth that occurred under Stalin in the USSR and Germany under Hitler. While they approached the economy in different ways, they were able to do phenomenal things to improve the lives of their citizens. Notice I said citizens, not the people living in the country. Castro significantly improved the quality of life for Cubans with improved education and healthcare. Tito repressed individual cultural expression, which prevented genocide, which broke out when the next leader encouraged ethnic nationalism. And while Iraq had their issues under Saddam Hussein, at least things were fairly organized. Now that we've introduced democracy to Iraq, there are parliamentary stalemates, and the economy is struggling. Many people complain that while they lived under fear under Hussein, at least they had reliable electricity. Democracy is slow and messy. Then again, democracy doesn't have torture chambers for political opponents. One last thing. I get so frustrated when people will call someone a communist fascist. Why? Because those two ideologies are on the opposite side of the spectrum. So how do you identify whether someone is a fascist or a communist political leader? Both communists and fascists use many of the techniques of a totalitarian dictatorship, but it's their reason for doing those things that makes them different. If they're fascist, they will want to promote the elite instead of promoting cooperation and equality. While both fascists and communists control the economy, the fascists do it so they can pay for the wars that will help them achieve world domination. Their economy is often corporatist, which means the rich will work with the government to encourage a mercantilist economy, which is capitalism with a splash of government controls. Fascists want to promote national ideals through emotion. They're often fanatical and encourage their citizens to follow their ideas based on faith rather than reason. The world is seen in terms of black and white, saying you're either with us or against us, instead of trying to find a compromise. The idea that some groups are superior to others is promoted, so fascist dictatorships are going to be racist and sexist. Finally, fascists do not want to work with other inferior groups or countries, so international treaties and organizations are ignored. Can you think of any modern-day leaders who exhibit these characteristics? Nazi Germany is a great historical example. The Nazis were able to justify the rejection of liberalism because it was their newly liberal government in 1919 that signed the hated Treaty of Versailles that got them into this mess. Authoritarianism had built German empires in the past, with the First Reich taking over the German Empire, the Second Reich being organized by Bismarck with his cry for blood and iron, and Hitler's Third Reich that he promised would last 1,000 years. Corporatism worked as many business owners became rich because of the Nazi control over the economy. The government was able to ignore international law. Hitler kept breaking treaties and agreements, and no one did much about it because Western nations were using appeasement, which then just made him look stronger. And probably the most important reason was fanatical ultranationalism. It's really easy when you can blame other people for your problems and say that your race is superior, which led to things like the Nuremberg Laws, which repressed the Jewish people. Another mistake people make is that they use the term communism to define all dictatorships when a communist society is left-wing, meaning you're ignoring all the right-wing authoritarians. In theory, communists want to control the economy to eventually achieve the goal of a fully cooperative society and then get rid of the dictatorship. Unlike the fascists, they don't want to achieve world domination through force, but instead show the world how awesome they are, and then the world will just want to join them. In theory, a communist is quite democratic, with periodic elections. There are stories of people getting the day off and free food at polling stations, so election day was like a great party. There was also a Bill of Rights similar to other democracies, including the right to a free press. In reality, those periodic elections were controlled by the government. There's a saying attributed to Stalin, "Those who cast the votes decide nothing. Those who count the votes decide everything." In Soviet elections, the government would tell you who you could vote for, only for members of the Communist Party since they're a one-party state. And if you wanted a different person, you'd have to write it on the ballot, and this was not secret ballot. Everyone would see what you were doing, and that could lead to a trip to the gulag. Same thing could happen if you didn't show up to vote. That sure helps to ensure a high voter turnout. The Bill of Rights did not have an enforcement clause, which meant if the government violated your rights, what are you going to do about it? There's no independent courts to go complain to. And don't forget those pesky secret police who would spy on you all the time and send you to jail if you did something as radical as make fun of Stalin's mustache. How did the Soviets justify having only one party? Heck, if we had the same ideology, why do we need any sort of opposition? Unlike the fascists who justify having only one party by pointing out they're superior to everyone else, so why would you bother having other parties that are less effective? And that free press was not so free. Instead, it was a propaganda tool that was used by the government to help unify the country. So how did the Soviet Union justify their rejection of liberalism? Well, look at how successful the country was under dictatorial rule. They avoided the Great Depression, they didn't have race riots or protests like the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, their women gained equality long before women were treated equally here in Canada, their literacy and healthcare was superior to many liberal nations in those early years, and their rapid industrialization allowed them to defeat the Nazis. And now consider, how is modern-day Russia both similar and different to the political system under communist rule from 1917 to 1990? And most importantly, do you see aspects of dictatorships in our Canadian society today? It's important to understand when the government is using constitutional power to do its job, and when we should be concerned we're turning into a dictatorship, and who decides when they're abusing their power.